In the dead of night on the 10th of October 1985, one of the most remarkable intercepts of the Cold War took place over the Mediterranean. In one action, it demonstrated how far carrier aviation had come in the 40 years since the end of the Second World War, and the options that carrier strike groups gave the US and NATO. The events that led up to that night had begun 3 days earlier, on Monday the 7th of October. Just after lunchtime, off the Egyptian coast, 4 Palestinian terrorists from the PLF faction of the PLO stormed into the dining room of the Italian cruise ship Achille Lauro, firing their AK-47s into the air. The ship's captain, Gerard de Rosa, made his way down to the dining room, where the hijackers demanded that he take the ship 300 miles northeast to Tartus in Syria. Captain de Rosa did so. At some point in the early moments, his crew managed to get off an SOS that was picked up by a monitoring station in Sweden, but otherwise the ship disappeared to external observers, causing a sea search to begin. In Washington, D.C., preparations were made for a potential hostage rescue attempt. Detachments from Delta Force and SEAL Team 6 were ordered to the British base at Akrotiri in Cyprus. As the ship was Italian, the Italian government also sent 60 paratroops, 4 helicopters, and people with knowledge of Achille Lauro's layout to Akrotiri. The basis of the tensions between Italy and the US over what to do about the hijacking thus began in the first hours after the news broke. According to later testimony from PLF leader Mohammed Abbas, the original plan had been to go to Israel and conduct an act of terror there. The hijackers had, however, been discovered cleaning their weapons by a steward and decided to take the ship instead. This story is generally agreed to be a false version of events, and I'll put some notes in the show notes about it. Regardless of the original plan, the ship arrived off Tartus at 11 a.m. on Tuesday the 8th. The terrorists made contact with the shore for the first time, demanding the release of 50 prisoners from Israeli jails. In a sinister turn of events, the terrorists stated that they would start killing hostages at 3 p.m. if their demands were not met. 3 p.m. duly arrived with no developments. A wheelchair-bound American named Leon Klinghoffer was selected, taken to the stern of the ship, shot, and killed. His body was thrown overboard. Captain de Rosa and one of the stewards were the only members of the passengers and crew who knew about the murder. Mr. Klinghoffer's wife was told that Leon was in the infirmary. De Rosa offered himself as the next victim in an attempt to protect others, but the hijackers dismissed this, instead selecting another passenger by way of their confiscated passports. Youssef Majad Mulki, the lead hijacker, radioed the Syrian authorities and told them that he'd killed a hostage and would kill more. This communication was apparently not fully believed in Rome and DC, even though it was intercepted. Mohammed Abbas now attempted to reach the hijackers via Egyptian military radios. The Egyptian Navy also sent a ship north towards Tartus in an attempt to relay his communications, but they were not able to reach the area fast enough. Abbas then succeeded in getting a coded message to his team via an Arabic language radio station on Cyprus. At 7:20 in the evening, de Rosa was ordered to take the ship back to its original destination at Port Said. When he made contact with his masters on the radio, Majed was told not to hurt the passengers. The US still wanted to mount an assault on the ship, though, but the Italian government resisted on the basis that they believed that no hostages had been harmed. The PLF now further muddied the waters with the first airing of the claim that the plan had been to attack Israeli targets and no harm was intended to the hostages. Given that there were doubts about this story, SEAL Team 6 were now embarked on USS Iwo Jima, with instructions to board the Achille Lauro in international waters, but not to intrude on Egyptian territorial waters. Before they could get within striking range, Achille Lauro docked at Port Said at 7:30 in the morning of Wednesday, October the 9th. With a gun to his head, Captain de Rosa went on the radio to announce that all passengers were alive and well. These assurances convinced the Egyptians and Italians that a diplomatic solution was appropriate. The terrorists were able to disembark at Port Said and made their escape. It was only when the ship was boarded that everyone learned of the death of Leon Klinghoffer. The US ambassador to Egypt demanded that the terrorists be arrested, only to be told by the foreign minister that they had left Egypt, and although the Egyptian authorities knew where they were, they wouldn't tell the Americans. They wouldn't tell the Italians or Israelis either, both of whom also wanted to put the hijackers on trial. All of these governments recognized a barefaced lie when they saw one. The Egyptian government knew exactly where the terrorists were because they were in Cairo, but they now had a problem. President Mubarak wanted to maintain the Camp David Accords that had secured peace with Israel. He also wanted to keep getting the billions of dollars of aid he was receiving from the US. But Israel had bombed the PLO headquarters in Tunis the week before, killing many innocent Tunisians. He couldn't be seen to do something that sided with the US and Israel against the Palestinians. As the hours passed, Israeli intelligence passed the location of the hijackers to the US military attaché in Tel Aviv, who duly passed it to the Pentagon and thus to the White House. They were at the Al Mazar airfield in Cairo and would shortly be put on a commercial EgyptAir flight to Tunis. In the White House, Navy Captain James Stark started to think about the problem of apprehending the terrorists. He later recalled that if they were planning to fly to Tunis, the aircraft could not overfly Libya en route because Egypt and Libya were at each other's throats. They also could not fly south over Chad because of the hostilities between Chad and Libya. The aircraft therefore had to fly over the Mediterranean Sea. It was then that I thought about intercepting the Egyptian airliner with US Navy fighters. In his musings, he recalled Operation Vengeance, which targeted the Japanese Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. Yamamoto had led the Pearl Harbor raid and was a key strategist in the Pacific War. In 1943, American intelligence learned of Yamamoto's planned trip to the Solomon Islands. US P-38 fighters intercepted the G4M Betty bomber he was traveling in and shot it down, killing him. After a brief moment of confusion in which Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North thought that Stark was proposing shooting down an Egyptian airliner, North too agreed that the plan was workable, and the two men took it to Admiral Poindexter, the Deputy National Security Advisor. Although unfamiliar with Operation Vengeance, the Admiral had also been wondering about an interception.
Is the U.S. willing to take action itself, Mr. President? Would the U.S. take military action to bring these people to justice?
You're now talking about whether we would invade a friendly nation if they were in the hands of a friendly nation. No, we're going to try to do this in a legal manner. The time for action that could have been taken by us is past and was ended when the rescue was made.
Did you consider...
The plan therefore got passed to President Reagan, who was at that moment touring the Sara Lee Bakery in Chicago. The president approved and detailed planning began in earnest. As it advanced, new Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger, who was traveling in Ottawa, got wind of the plan. He hated the idea and attempted to convince the president on a call from his Gulfstream G20 to Air Force One. Broadcast on an open channel, it was intercepted and later published by ham radio operators. The discussion became heated. Weinberger explained to the president that US fighters might have to fire shots across the nose of the airliner in order to make it change course. Reagan closed the debate by saying that he didn't care what it took, he wanted the plane forced down in friendly territory. Late in the afternoon of the 10th of October, the decision was made to attempt the intercept. Instructions were thus flashed to USS Saratoga. Saratoga was in the Mediterranean for a 6-month deployment, serving as the flagship of a 6th Fleet Task Force commanded by Rear Admiral David Jeremiah. The task force had just finished a NATO exercise. Saratoga was at sea heading towards Dubrovnik in Yugoslavia, but had not yet entered the Adriatic. Late in the evening, local time on October the 10th, Vice Admiral Frank Kelso, commander of the 6th Fleet, ordered Saratoga and her accompanying ships to reverse course. This was actually the second time in a matter of days that the battle group had swung around. After the initial hijacking, she had moved southeast and operated to the west of Crete. A TARPS-equipped Tomcat had even photographed Achille Lauro off Egypt in preparation for a boarding action. So Admiral Jeremiah had previously dispatched aircraft in an attempt to locate the ship. Even so, he was rather surprised when Kelso ordered him to send his aircraft out to locate and intercept a commercial jet carrying the hijackers out of Egypt. Admiral Kelso's instructions did not specify exactly how Jeremiah was supposed to locate a jet flying on an unknown course without a transponder over a large dark sea. Figuring that problem out fell to Saratoga Air Wing Commander Robert Bubba Brodsky. Carrier Air Wing 17 had 2 fighter squadrons, VF-74 Bedevilers and VF-103 Sluggers, both flying the F-14A Tomcat. 2 of the attack squadrons, VA-81 Sunliners and VA-83 Rampagers, flew the A-7E Corsair II, rather than the new and more flexible FA-18A. VA-85 Black Falcons operated the A-6E Intruder, and usefully the KA-6D Tanker. Air Wing 17 specialist squadrons would also be vital in such a complicated mission. VAW-125 Tiger Tails flew the Grumman E-2C Hawkeye. There was no chance of finding the airliner without the Hawkeye. VAQ-132 Scorpions flew the Grumman EA-6B Prowler and could jam the Egyptian airliner's comms, cutting it off from support. The S-30 Diamond Cutters with their Lockheed S-3A Vikings and HS-3 Trident Sea Kings were probably less useful. The Vikings had participated in the earlier, fruitless search for the liner. Saratoga was at alert 60 with weapons stowed and aircraft tied down. The first job was therefore to get some planes ready for action. Brodsky didn't expect his pilots to have to shoot down the mysterious airliner, but the scant operational details he did have suggested that his aircraft might have to fly near Libyan airspace. That always came with the risk of interception. It was also possible that warning shots might be needed to persuade the Egyptian pilot to comply. Red-shirted ordnance sailors on the carrier's deck thus got to work offloading the AIM-7s from F-14s on the deck. Once they'd finished that job, they shone their flashlights on the noses of the fighter's Sidewinder missiles to check whether they were live and ready to fire. The heat of the flashlight beams was enough to send tones from the live missiles into the pilot's earphones, prompting them to give a thumbs-up signal to the launching crew on a dark deck. Tracers were loaded up into the magazine that fed the 20mm Vulcan cannons. While the deck crew was getting on with that, Saratoga turned into the wind and, at about 6:45 in the evening local time, launched a Hawkeye and a pair of Tomcats, carrying the usual mix of Sparrows and Sidewinders. From tasking to launch had taken just 22 minutes. For the pilots, the details of what they were being launched for were a bit sketchy. A pair of KA-6Ds and an EA-6B followed them off to tank fighters and to assist in the search. The Hawkeye flew southeast and began to scan the skies towards Cairo. The Tomcats topped off their tanks from the Texaco and then took up station south of Crete, while the E-2 looked for targets. Around an hour later, a pair of the Sidewinder and tracer-armed Tomcats were launched. This enabled a patrol line to be set up between Crete and Benghazi. Some sources have it that a US Air Force RC-135 and a Navy EA-3, both carrying Arabic speakers, were also part of this line. Back on Saratoga, a second Hawkeye was hooked up to the catapult, as were more Tomcats and at least one KA-6D. The commander of VAW-125, Commander Ralph Zier, probably had the clearest picture of what was going on and the geometry of the operation. He was commanding the second E-2 and was listening in while the Tomcats were vectored onto one contact, which turned out to be a Soviet IL-76, and then another. This was a pair of C-141s flying with their lights out. They were carrying Delta Force to Sigonella in Sicily, where the F-14s had now been instructed to direct the airliner. It was amazing how many aircraft flew over the Med with their lights off, the pilots realized. Sometime around this point, Israeli intelligence once more came through with information. In this case, it was the tail number of the EgyptAir Boeing 737. The Boeing had taken off from Al-Mazar at 10 p.m. Egyptian time, and it had the call sign EgyptAir 2843. Commander Zier launched at about 9:30 in the evening and assumed direct control of the operation as Tiger Tail 603. He directed fighters to as many as 6 or 8 other targets with no success. Then he saw another blip and vectored 2 Tomcats, one piloted by Steve Weatherspoon, Atlantic Fleet Pilot of the Year 1974 no less. The other was piloted by William Massey. Weatherspoon stayed back while Massey and his Rio, Dennis Plautz, closed in to do the identification. Although it's easy to be chill about what Massey was about to do, it was a remarkable piece of flying. He was putting a fighter that probably weighed in excess of 50,000 pounds at this point within 15 feet of a passenger airliner flying at 34,000 feet and travelling at 400 knots. Plautz shone his flashlight on the tail. The identifier read SUAYK. Massey called Zier in Saratoga, confirming that they had the right plane. Blissfully unaware of what was happening so close by, the EgyptAir pilot flew on through the night. Finished with the quote-unquote easy part, Zier now had to orchestrate an event that the pilots had never practiced. They had to safely force a civilian airliner to land. Back in DC, the National Security Council staff and the State Department were busy attempting to make arrangements with other governments to limit the Egyptian airliner's options if the Navy could not force it to land at Sigonella. President Reagan sent a cable to the Tunisian president requesting that he deny landing rights to the 737. The State Department also sent similar requests to Athens and Beirut. President Reagan did, however, insist that the Navy aircraft not shoot down the EgyptAir jet if it didn't cooperate. He would rather have seen the hijackers get away than kill innocent people on board the plane. The Pentagon issued those rules of engagement to Saratoga, and they were passed on to the Tomcat crews. Just to add to the diplomatic complication, Israeli intelligence now confirmed that Mohammed Abbas himself was aboard the aircraft. Out in the Mediterranean, Rear Admiral Jeremiah instructed Zia and the Tomcat pilots to simply follow the 737 for the time being, since it was heading in the general direction of Sigonella. 2 more aircraft were vectored to follow it, establishing positions all around. But soon Zia, who was monitoring the airliner's communications, heard Tunis deny the airliner permission to land. Flight 2843 then called Athens, which also refused authorization. Orbiting south of Crete, the 737 contacted Cairo for instructions, and controllers there told the pilot to return to Egypt. When Zia heard this, he consulted with Saratoga and Jeremiah, who instructed him to make radio contact with the airliner. EgyptAir 2843, this is Tiger Tail 603, over. Zia radioed. He knew full well that the Egyptian pilot wouldn't have a clue who Tiger Tail 603 was, but he didn't want to confuse the other Navy pilots. Things were confusing enough. The 737 pilot didn't respond, so Zia tried again. EgyptAir 2843, this is Tiger Tail 603, over. Now he got a response, albeit a confused one. The Egyptian pilot asked him to identify himself. Zia told him that he was being escorted by US Navy fighters and instructed him to proceed to Sigonella, Italy, giving him the compass course to follow. The pilot maintained his heading. So Zia ordered the 2 closest Tomcats to turn on their position lights. As passengers on board the airliner looked out of the windows, the Egyptian pilot responded, "I'm saying you're too close. I'm following your orders. Don't be too close, please." The 737 pilot remained remarkably calm during those moments, according to a pilot of a nearby El Al plane, which was flying from Israel to Madrid. He was listening in as the Egyptian told an Athens air controller that he'd been intercepted by 2 jet fighters. He later told an Israeli newspaper that he'd been amazed by the pilot's coolness as he briefed the more agitated Greek, then asked Athens to advise Cairo of the intercept. Since the Tomcats lacked the right type of radio to communicate with the airline pilot, all communications were routed through Zia on the Hawkeye. The Egyptian pilot was therefore of the opinion that Tiger Tail 603 was alongside him, and Zia did nothing to disabuse him of this idea. He told Flight 2843's pilot what direction to fly in order to get to Sigonella, and what radio channels to use in contacting the airfield. Then the whole entourage of Flight 2843, Zia and his Hawkeye, 4 Tomcats, including Weatherspoons and Masseys, headed towards Sigonella. The C-141s carrying the special operators also joined this curious, silent caravan heading west. Sigonella was a NATO airbase about 15 miles from Catania on the east coast of Sicily. In DC, Admiral Poindexter waited until the Navy pilots had persuaded the Egyptian to cooperate before he got in touch with Prime Minister Craxi of Italy. The latter promised to provide permission to land. About 150 miles out from Sigonella, one of the Tomcats contacted the airfield control and advised them that Flight 2843 was inbound. This request was denied, apparently because Craxi's approval had not yet reached Sicily. After repeated refusals, Zia told the Egyptian pilot to declare a low fuel emergency, a move that granted authorization to land. A US Navy officer assigned to the NATO base reportedly grabbed the microphone from his Italian counterpart and gave the permission to land. With his first pass too low, the Egyptian pilot went around a second time and finally landed at 1:30 a.m. Italian time. The Navy aircraft returned to Saratoga, but not before a TARPS-equipped Tomcat snapped a picture of the 737 on the runway. As the airliner taxied to a stop, members of SEAL Team 6, who had been left behind earlier in the week, drove out to the taxiway and surrounded the airliner. Within moments, 2 darkened Air Force C-141s also landed and parked on the main runway to block its use. Troops from the aircraft reinforced the perimeter around the airliner. Snipers took positions with a clear view of the plane's doors. A bit later, the Italian Carabinieri arrived in force. 80 US troops were thus surrounding the aircraft, themselves surrounded by 300 Italians. The diplomatic intricacies that followed are not particularly relevant to the aviation aspects of the story. The Italians were happy to arrest the hijackers, but they had no beef with Mohammed Abbas and his deputies. After some wrangling, the White House reluctantly accepted Italian jurisdiction over the affair, and late on the 11th of October, the Italian government decided that EgyptAir 2843 could fly to Rome with the hijackers Abbas and his lieutenants. 11 Egyptian government guards and the rest of the passengers were also on board and went with them. In DC, there was real concern that as soon as he took off, the pilot would simply fly back to Cairo. On the ground, the Special Forces commander, Major General Carl Steiner, shared this view. He therefore prepared a US Navy T-39 executive jet so he could follow the 737. At 10 p.m., EgyptAir 2843 taxied towards the main runway. The Carabinieri blocked off all other entrances to it. As the airliner lifted off, Steiner ordered the T-39 to take off too. Without access to the runway, the Navy aircraft used an adjacent taxiway to take off. The Italians reacted to the latest American act of bravado by launching a pair of F-104S starfighters to escort the airliner to Rome. Pilots on board the US and Italian jets exchanged colourful epithets over the radio about their respective intentions, family heritage, and sexual preferences. 2 more starfighters formed up as well to get involved, so yet another strange formation of aircraft flew towards an Italian airfield. This is where things get frankly a bit silly, given that we're talking about 2 NATO allies. As they flew along, Italian ground controllers picked up several contacts approaching. According to the Italians, the unknown aircraft approached much too close, attempting to force the less maneuverable starfighters away from the 737. Finally, one of the Italian pilots warned the nearest aircraft to move away or he would likely cause a collision. Seconds later, there came a response in US English that there are 2 F-14As of the US Navy nearby and that they wanted to take the Boeing 737 under their control. The Italians remained stubborn, however, and wouldn't pull back. Therefore, and as the whole formation meanwhile approached Rome, both Tomcats had to turn away. Reportedly, their egress was covered by an EA-6B, which jammed the Italians' radars and radios. The T-39 continued to Ciampino, but when it got there, Italian air traffic control refused to clear the executive jet to land. So, for the second time in a few days, the T-39 declared an in-flight emergency and eventually landed at the airport without permission. This unauthorized landing, along with the crisis at Sigonella and the American attempts to divert the 737, negatively influenced diplomatic relations between Italy and the US for some time. Although the hijackers were brought to justice, unfortunately Mohammed Abbas was able to escape. He was ultimately captured in a Special Forces raid during the invasion of Iraq in April 2003. He later died in custody. Irrespective, the most audacious aerial police action in history was over.